Good morning. I hope you are having a great start to this year's National School of Community Networks in Tanzania. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this gathering, even though remotely. My name is Josephine Miliza, and I work as the Africa Policy Coordinator for the APC LockNet initiative. And my contributions today will be just around how, as community networks, we can be able to advocate for more enabling policy and regulatory environments that are supportive of community networks. The LockNet initiative is an initiative that is a partnership between APC and Rhizomatica. In full, LockNet is Local Access and Community Networks Initiative. The initiative started in 2018, and over the past year, since 2019, we have been able to support 50 initiatives across 16 countries. The initiative works in low-income areas across 3 continents, which is Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with the aim of contributing to an enabling ecosystem for the emergence and growth of community networks, as well as community-based initiatives. The project is supported by the UK and Swedish governments. So in relation to our conversation or our discussion today around connectivity or achieving universal connectivity, we find that digital acceleration has really picked up, and universal connectivity has become a topic that is discussing not just access as a luxury, but really as a human right, as well as a basic need, as more and more of our lives or the line between the offline world and the online world continue to be blurry. We find more employment opportunities, more issues around livelihoods, access to information, as well as social connections really are getting online. And so it's important that every citizen or every person has access to universal connectivity that is affordable to them. And over the years, especially as we can see on the first graph, is that the number of internet users has been growing. And in 2021, we were able to reach 65% of individuals using the internet. However, in low and middle income countries, we find that the growth is stagnating, especially in our continent, which is Africa. Connectivity is still, or universal connectivity is still at 33%. And some of the issues that contribute to the digital divide include access, affordability, as well as the adoption and use of ICTs. Affordability is critical to access. Affordability is critical to access. Just a minute. Affordability is critical to access, and we find that statistics show that for internet to be affordable, it needs to be at 2% of the gross national income per capita. And as shown in the graph on the screen, developed countries are at most of them are at 1.2%, but in Africa, for example, we see that affordability is an issue because we are way past the line, which is 2%, and we are at 18.6%. So for us to be able to achieve universal and meaningful access, then we really need to look at solutions that will be able to address the affordability divide. Although the number of individual users has been growing over time, what we find is that the rate of growth is stagnating as we get to the more hard to reach areas or hard to connect areas. It's not just an issue of connectivity, but it's also other underlying issues that need to be looked at, and that's why I'm quite happy that in this discussion or during the school, the theme is really looking at what are the usage gaps at the last mile level, and so here we find that as we get to the hard to reach areas, it's not just an issue of access, but also issues around skills, around affordability, not just affordability of the internet itself, but well, affordability of devices also need to be addressed. The COVID-19 accelerated a lot of digital transformation as well as the adoption of internet. We saw a move of majority of work, especially for those who are connected, being able to continue with education, being able to continue with work. However, it illuminated a long-standing issue, and that is that many low-income communities around the world do not have either access to reliable internet, or it is not affordable to them. So in terms of looking at the digital divide, the issues that need to be addressed are issues around the lack of infrastructure. So how do we ensure that we have sufficient infrastructure to the last mile? Also issues around affordability. How do we create, how do we address the issues of affordability? How do we address the issues of skills? Also, how do we address the issues of digital content? But also, we also need to address other aspects such as the gender gap. We know there's a gender digital divide. Also looking at how do we ensure the elderly, especially in low income areas or in the rural areas, also have access to the internet, so that we don't continue to increase the age gap in terms of digital connectivity. And also, as majority of our populations, especially in Africa, live in rural areas, it's important that we look for solutions that are able to address the urban, rural digital divide. So for the digital inequality, which continues to increase, for it to be addressed, then there is definitely need to look at complementary solutions. And this is important as we now begin discussions around community networks or community-based connectivity solutions, is how do they come in to complement what is already existing? What are some of the gaps will they be filling in areas, for example, where there is access but there's not affordability, or where there's also issues such as access, issues such as skills, as well as availability of locally relevant content. During this year's WTDC, we find that discussions around complementary access networks are getting at the global, at the regional, as well as national level. And it's great that we now have policymakers and regulators coming to an understanding or a realization that we need complementary access solutions, innovative solutions that can be able to look at sustainable business models that ensure last mile connectivity. So as part of Resolution 37, during this year's World Telecommunications Development Conference by the ITU, we found the adoption of complementary access networks and solutions as one of the approaches or innovative approaches to closing the digital divide. And tied to it, to complementary access solutions, we find that one of complementary access solutions is community networks was identified, in that they are able to create innovative approaches that look at holistic approaches to the digital inclusion. The community networks movement continues to grow in Africa. Currently, we have about 42 initiatives across 14 countries. They are mostly concentrated in East and Southern Africa, but we hope that with more movement building, with more advocacy, we'll begin to see West African countries as well as Central African countries really growing in terms of the movement. And we look at community networks as an approach that provide holistic approach to digital inclusion, because they not only address issues around access to infrastructure or affordability, but also look at other issues such as building capacity, providing platforms, as well as locally relevant content for community. And all this contribute towards catalyzing our local economies. Over the years since 2015, if I'm not wrong, we've been having, I think it was 2016, we've been having the Africa Community Network Summit. Our last physical one was hosted by Tanzania, and we were all happy to be there, which was hosted by the University of Dodoma in collaboration with Kondoa Community Network. And so we can see that in terms of movement building, Tanzania has been very critical, a critical partner in supporting the growth of community networks in the region. So what can we do to be able to provide an enabling environment for CNs? It's important that we have a community networks operator license that is affordable to communities, that is affordable to communities, that it is reachable, and also addresses some of the administrative and regulatory issues that communities can be able to not just to afford, but also can be able to deal with. We understand that across many regions and also across many nations, it was not envisioned that small operators will be able to provide connectivity. But a lot of innovation, with the growth, especially in terms of fiber connectivity as fast at the first mile level as well as the middle mile level, we find that there's more reach in terms of internet connectivity. Also growth in terms of Wi-Fi, innovations around Wi-Fi, so equipment has become more affordable. So there is room to nurture small scale operators, including community networks. And with how the current frameworks have been put in place, they are not really friendly, or they are not really viable options for small operators. So there is need for countries to be able to relook their licensing approach and create licenses that are specific to community networks. We are happy that across the region, through engagement with regulators and policymakers, this is a conversation that has been happening. In Kenya, in 2020 going into 2021, APC together with Kigoma, with support from the UK government, worked together with the regulator to look at the Kenya telecommunications market structure, engage with stakeholders in the market, and then come up with a licensing framework for community networks in the country. And just to provide more context into it, is that initially, as of 2020, how our market structure in Kenya was, is that we had the tier one, who would be able to provide national coverage. And we can see that in terms of the initial operating fees, these were quite high, 15 million Kenya shillings, quite out of reach for small scale operators, whether they are commercial or non-commercial operators. Tier 2 similarly was really out of scope, and they will provide regional coverage. And we can see here that the amount still would be quite high, 15 million Kenya shillings as the initial operating fees, as well as the annual operating fees were quite out of reach for communities. Now, several community networks that exist in Kenya had started looking at the tier 3, which now would be maybe a bit affordable. But also this was quite out of reach, 200,000 Kenya shillings. If our exchange rate was at 100, that would be about $2,000 US. Also quite out of reach for small communities who they have to mobilize to mobilize resources for CAPEX and OPEX to start their community networks, and also look at the licensing and regulation. In addition to the national or in addition to the infrastructure license, you'd also need to get what we call an application service provider license, as well as the content service provider license. And so what now the engagement took place was that we engaged with some of the existing pilot community networks in Kenya. We also spoke to quite a number of stakeholders in the industry to just try to understand what are some of the issues that contribute to affecting their ability to be able to provide affordable access. For the existing community networks, we wanted to understand what are some of the regulatory barriers that they faced in terms of getting licensed, and also what was, what would be the reception of existing operators in Kenya if the community networks license was now introduced as part of our framework. And issues came up around affordable access, issues such as interference came up, issues around expensive access to spectrum, taxes was an issue, administrative burdens within the regulatory frameworks in Kenya. And in speaking to the community networks, it will be that there was need for a more affordable licensing framework. And at the end of that work, in 2021, October, the Communications Authority of Kenya came up with a community network service provider license. And this license is exclusively for non-profit cooperative societies, community-based organizations, and non-governmental organizations. They are limited to a sub-county to operate within a sub-county. And the license includes both the network facilities, the application service provider, and the application service provider license in a single license. Their fees were set lower than a tier 3 national facility provider license category. And so this would now be the introduction of what we call a tier 4 license. The regulator will be continuing work to see what that looks like for commercial operators, but for not-for-profit operators, the community network service provider licenses will be exempted from USF contributions. The application fee was set at $10 with an annual and operating fee of $50 a year, and the license would be for a 10-year period. So this, I think, is some of the progressive work that we are seeing around in creating enabling environments for community networks. Zimbabwe also is another country that has made progress in terms of creating a specific license for community networks. In 2021 as well, the POTRAZ, which is the Postal and Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe, published a statutory instrument, and in it, it introduced the Community Internet Service Provider license. And similar to Kenya, the application fee was set at $50 with a renewal fee of $50 as well. They will be exempted. So at district level, as well as community internet service providers will be exempted from USF contributions. And this was quite monumental. And we even saw the Ministry of ICT going to launch the Murambinda Community Network Initiative, which is one of the existing and longest standing community networks in Zimbabwe, as well as in Africa. Then even beyond licensing, it's an issue now around shared spectrum frameworks. In Kenya, for example, from the work around the licensing and shared framework for community networks, one of the recommendations that came up was in terms of reviewing a spectrum fee framework, recognizing there is a need to significantly reduce the fees for rural and underserved areas. This is something that the authority is working on this year, as well as looking at the current spectrum fees and seeing how they will be realigned to fit the current times. Consideration of a spectrum fee waiver scheme for community networks or small operators is something that the operator has also put in its medium-term plans and is currently under review. Conducting an international approaches to the creation of more localized access to IMT. This is also part of the medium-term strategy for the regulator in Kenya. Review the guidelines on the use of radio frequency spectrum by short-range devices, and be able to amend ERIP limits for Wi-Fi point-to-point and point-to-multi-point use. Sorry, this has been reviewed and already published. So this is something that the regulator has already worked on. Review operations for lowering the barrier to use other license exempt bands for point-to-point and point-to-multi-point in the use of the 24 gigahertz as well as 60 gigahertz. And the last one, in terms of expanding the range of available license exempt use, especially within the range of 5 to 6 gigahertz. Together with the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, this is something that the regulator already worked on and is actually now in its implementation phases. South Africa also has made progress in terms of access to spectrum, and just recently they released a draft spectrum policy, and in it we can see one of the recommendations was that around alternative network infrastructure. And here it looks at to be able to bridge connectivity gaps, extend broadband access, and provide reliable data services for rural, remote, and underserved communities, including all low-income areas and secondary cities and towns. This policy supports the development of alternative infrastructure such as Wi-Fi and community networks. So as of September, this is within their license. And as you can see, also at 2.12, they look at the issues around community networks and what would be within the policy of South Africa adopting community networks. And so it's great to see more, like not just conversations around community networks, so adoption in policy documents of community networks at global level or at regional level with the Africa Union Commission. But it's also great to see that at national level, countries such as Kenya, Zimbabwe, and South Africa are making a progress. Dynamic spectrum in Africa, there's also an opportunity, especially for TV white spaces, and this is something that Dr. Matogoro has been actively advocating for. And so far, we have formal regulations in South Africa, in Kenya, and Mozambique, and we hope that more and more countries will be able to review and adopt formal regulations around TV white spaces as and unlock access to spectrum, especially for rural areas. For community networks to be sustainable, we also need to look at the issues of financing. And for many of our initiatives, our financing has been mostly through grants, international agencies. And so to be able to streamline at national level, it's important that financing also comes from the Universal Service Fund. Both Zimbabwe and Kenya have made progress towards this, but just to look at the Kenyan case, for example, in 2021, there was a gap study that was done to look at the data the voice and data gap study, and community networks were identified as a model that could be used, that could be funded through USF, not only to provide connectivity, but also to address issues around capacity building. And now in our current Universal Service Fund strategy that starts 2022 to 2026, community networks have been adopted, and the regulator plans to establish 100 community networks in the next 5 years. So again, this is monumental progress, and that we are quite happy to see. So the next big things will be a lot of small things, and we really advocate for the support or for the creation of an enabling policy and regulatory environment in Tanzania that could be able to support the growth of community networks. So thank you all for listening to me. I really do hope you enjoy the next couple of days available. If any information is needed, I'll be happy to support. Enjoy, and thank you.